Hi everyone, welcome. We'll just give it a minute and let everybody get into the webinar. Hi everyone, welcome. We're just giving it a minute, let everybody in. Okay, let's get started. Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining today. My name is Shannon Ganem, and I'm the Global Education Director at Magnum Photos. And with my colleague, Pauline Vermare, Cultural Director at Magnum Photos New York, we are your hosts for the Beyond Magnum Talks program. Beyond Magnum is an in-depth talks program created to address and explore some of the challenges facing the photographic industry today. If you missed our launch event, I would encourage you to visit the Beyond Magnum page on the Magnum website, where you can hear more from our president, Olivia Arthur, about the genesis and aims of the program. We also have yesterday's incredible conversation with Sim-Chi Yin and Wayne Modest, and recordings will be added there after each event. So a little bit of housekeeping. You'll be able to participate via the Q&A box. Please put in any comments or questions, and we'll endeavor to get to as many of those as we can. If we don't answer your question, please know that we're collating these and we look to build these into our reflections at the end of each chapter and the series. We recognize that this series of events will likely raise more questions than answer them, and it is the beginning of a conversation. So thank you for your contributions to that dialogue. You can find all of our speaker bios on the Beyond Magnum page. Being mindful of time, sometimes we might just do brief introductions, but you've got the full detail there. Please also note we have the full Chapter 2 program online, and we hope that you'll join us for that starting next Wednesday. Please note we have 2 sessions today, and we will aim to have a 10-minute break between these. So we'll be wrapping up at 2:50 British summertime, and we'll start again at 3 o'clock, and it's on the same link. And with that, I will hand over to Pauline and invite you to kick off our first discussion and introduce our speakers. Thanks, Pauline.
Thank you, Shannon. Hello, everybody. Thank you for being here with us today to talk about archives and legacy. Thank you so much for our speakers today. We're going to be talking about Ernest Cole, the South African photographer, and about his legacy and the content of the archive. Today with us are Leslie Maltaisane, who is the nephew of Ernest Cole and the head of his estate based in South Africa. We also have James Sanders, who is a researcher, historian, journalist, and author. Mark Sanders, who is a curator, photo historian, and art consultant. Leslie, James, and Mark are heading the estate and doing all the research on the archive and biographical and historical research. And together, we have Hamish Crooks, who is here today, who's the former licensing director at Magnum Photos and who was instrumental in getting the US archive of Ernest Cole digitalized, working closely with the estate. He's also the head of the Abbas estate. So this conversation is part of this chapter on archives, and I'd like to connect it directly to the introductory talk that Nwagbogu and Asya Yaghmurian gave 2 days ago now on the importance of the journey of archives and who cares for the archive. And the archive is about preserving and documenting and researching, caring and sharing. And I'd like to talk about all of this today on the topic specifically of Ernest Cole's life and work. I'm going to share my screen. And so I'd love to start by asking you, Leslie, if you could give us some biographical elements on the life of Ernest Cole, and then James, maybe also you'll want to add to that, and we can start with that, and then we can unfold and unpack the archive and see what the discoveries have been for you all in the past 5 years. Leslie, please.
Thank you, Pauline. Yes, thank you so much. The bio of Ernest Cole. I will just quickly say that Ernest Cole, born Kule Ernest Levi Tsulwani. He was born on the 21st of March, 1940, in Eerstras, Gauteng. Then it was known as Transvaal in South Africa. And then he died on the 11th of February, 1990 in New York, United States, after spending 24 years in exile. In summary, Ernest Cole was born Ernest Levi Tsulwani Kule on 21 March 1914, a black freehold of Eerstras, about 16 kilometers east of Pretoria, Transvaal. He was the fourth of the 6 children born to Theophilus Kule and Martha Kule. He spent part of his childhood living with his aunt in Onverwag, a small town approximately 40 kilometers home in order to complete his primary school education. In 1955, he returned home to live with his parents and enrolled at the local high school, the Kilnerton Training Institute. The next year, he dropped out of school following the implementation of Bantu Education Act. This act, authorized by Hendrik French Verwoerd, introduced segregation in the South African education system. It was designed to ensure that Black and colored students were trained for manual labor jobs and rather than higher level jobs reserved for whites. Cole himself once said it was a system geared to position millions of African children by giving them an inferior education. Yeah, that's briefly the bio of Ernest Cole. James, I'm sure you can take over and add more.
Well, the story of Ernest Cole is particularly strange because it's loaded with a lot of mythology and a lot of lacking information. So everything Leslie said is absolutely right. But what is lacking in our understanding of so much of Ernest's life is the exact details of what happened and when they happened. And we sort of have a sweep of understanding that has been built up by various writers over the last 30 years, 40 years even. But what we didn't have until relatively recently was some detail. Okay, so before the archive was discovered, we had no real idea of what Ernest had been doing in America as a photographer. We know he published House of Bondage in 1967 and that it was a significant success. We know that he received these scholarships from the Ford Foundation and other places, which paid for his lifestyle for a period of years. We know that he went to Sweden and became involved with Tia Photo, the Swedish film collective. But there was hardly any evidence of any product from any of this. I think that Leslie's family had a handful of photographs that were taken in America, prints, and one single negative until 2017. That was all they actually had. So we have no real idea of what happened to him. Ernest's life after 1972 is a total mystery. I mean, nobody really can authoritatively say what happened to him, why it happened to him, or how he resurfaced at a certain point. And it is just rumor and conjecture 90% of the explanation of Ernest Cole's life. And so the most important job for any researcher is to try to cut through all the exaggeration and the sort of romantic tragedy and base it in a form of reality of what actually happened to this guy. And also, what was he actually doing? What was his preoccupation as an artist after doing House of Bondage? I think that sort of opens up the enormous number of questions there are around even basic details of his biography.
Yeah, thank you. And so could we start maybe by talking about House of Bondage, which is what Ernest Cole is most famous for, and the influence that it had, it had so much influence on so many practitioners to this day. Could we talk a little bit about this book?
Do you think Hamish should say something at this stage? He's quite good on.
Sorry, I was on mute. Yeah, House of Bondage. I mean, House of Bondage was probably, talking personally, it's I put it up with one of the in my top 5 photography books, and I've looked at a lot of photography books, probably not as much as I'd like to, but it's still. And I actually put it up there with things like Vietnam Inc. Partly because of probably the impact it had on me and probably the time that I looked at it. And I can say from a personal point of view, it was, I'd seen another book. My father had a lot of photography books, and one of them was by Peter Magibane. And, my youthful sort of anger against the apartheid regime, this was going back into the 70s, early 80s, where the ANC and the anti-apartheid movement was very strong. And even though this book was from 1967, and I'd seen a book by another photojournalist in South Africa, Peter Magibane, and I thought that was really interesting, and it was a brilliant book, and it's really informed me a lot about photography and generally activism type photography. But then my dad put that book and said, if you thought that one was good, look at this one, House of Bondage. And it blew me away. And the picture I remember the most being, I was probably about 11, 12, was the picture of the man slapping the kid in the face. It just sort of, it stops you dead. One, it's a brilliant photograph, but two, just what you're documenting was for me, I wanted to kill the man who, you want to go out and kill that person who's doing that. And those strong emotions coming from that book. I mean, the book was done in an era where people, photography has always been used as, does photography change the world? And I'm not sure it really ever does. There's certain books and certain photographs. If you think of things like Alan Kurdi, the photograph from, there's certain photographs that we all go into our consciousness, like the Alan Kurdi picture from the recently in coming from Syria and crossing to Europe. But House of Bondage in 67 was really, this isn't an era where the South African government was trying to hide what apartheid was about. And then you get this book like House of Bondage. And I heard the story of how, Ernest Cole had gone to Magnum in Paris, sneaked the negatives out of South Africa slowly through his friendship through Joseph Lelyveld, who was ended up being editor of the New York Times. And the minute everyone saw this book, I mean, this isn't the book that Ernest wanted, which is quite interesting. It's not the book that he wanted, but anyone looking at this book and you didn't know about apartheid, this is the book that you probably had to make. What Ernest actually foresaw for the book was something more like The Europeans by Henri Cartier-Bresson. He was a great admirer of Cartier-Bresson and the style, and that style does come out in a lot of his pictures. Style and content and form over content comes out. But as a book, when you look at it, every picture in there is an accusation against apartheid. It's probably one of the strongest books. And that's where my comparison with Vietnam Inc. comes in, because every time you turn a page in Vietnam Inc., it's an accusation as the pictures. But what Ernest actually wanted was something that was more nuanced about life in South Africa. It wasn't merely just politics and but I think the rest of the world needed to know that. And this book became a massive success because of that, because people did not know what was going on in South Africa and why this book was so important. It was, and I think Ernest coming, the most important thing that's coming out is Ernest was living this life himself. And that's quite rare in any book that you see. I mean, even say you could talk about Vietnam Inc., which I've mentioned, that's Philip Jones Griffiths going to Vietnam, and it obviously it goes into his longer general studies about anti-colonialism. But the difference with something like Ernest was he's living this life. He's going back home and this is the life that he leads. And that's very different in photojournalism, because most photojournalism that we look at it's a photojournalist going in and you're photographing the other as such. What's interesting when Ernest gets to America is that he's the other. He's photographing America like the other. And so the book, the House of Bondage is probably the, it was, for me, it was like, how could he beat, this is the sum of, as a body of work, which sums up your oeuvre, your work. It's amazing. But actually the American work really adds to it. It's very different, but it really adds to it. But the House of Bondage it's still probably one of the most important books by a photographer who's living the life of what is being depicted in the pictures. I don't know if someone else wants to elaborate.
Yeah, I wanted to say one thing about House of Bondage, which maybe James can expand on, because I know he knows the story better than I do. But isn't it the case, James, that Ernest, when he was shooting House of Bondage, they had different status of passes status in South Africa, and that from black to coloured you could get more access, etc. And didn't Ernest change or managed to get his status changed, so he was able to get more access to be, so a lot of the book is shot even clandestinely in a way, right? So
yes,
sort of under the radar. Maybe you can expand a little bit on that.
Yeah, sure. Certainly Ernest reclassified from black, in inverted commas, to coloured, which is the South African descriptor for someone of mixed race. But as Leslie explained to me a long time ago, so did Ernest's younger brother and sister make that journey, and that it was one of the options that, if you knew how to do it, to beat the system, you could get advantages, from playing the system. I mean, it was just a bureaucratic structure, the idea of you are this race or you are that race, however cruel and tragic it could be to people. So he was quite prepared to use whatever means necessary in order to get these photographs. Of more interest to me is two things. One's the spy quality of a lot of his work. He has this really interesting ability to photograph almost invisibly things that come across his path. And so the picture that Hamish was describing of the white man hitting the black kid in the street, you get the feeling that the white man never saw Ernest Cole take that picture. I mean, Ernest is somewhere in the undergrowth, snapping away. And there are similar pictures in the American collection of him photographing people close up, doing things they might not be happy being photographed doing. And that is one of the recurring features of Cole, is that he seems to be able to get amazingly close to people without them understanding that he's photographing. That the nude pictures of the miners that's so famous, I learned from a former South African president, actually, who I showed some of the extra pictures here to. And he told me that this was undoubtedly initiation day on the mines. It was the day when the miners joined up for the first day. And Ernest, according to legend, had a camera hidden under a packet of sandwiches. And certainly the politician I spoke to said to me that he must have applied for a job at the mines in order to get those photographs. He wasn't allowed in there. I mean, black photographers and white photographers weren't just randomly allowed into the mines to photograph people.
Although David Goldblatt did, didn't he? David Goldblatt did some photographs, did he not?
But 7 years later, 7 or 8 years later.
Yeah.
Okay, so and at that stage, it's a white writer, Nadine Gordimer, and David Goldblatt are allowed into the mines to do a project about photographing the mines. But the idea of letting in a already quite well-known black photographer who was a freelance, who had worked for some of the left-wing newspapers in South Africa, the mining companies would never have allowed that out of choice. So he had to do it sneakily. And part of the sneaky quality, sneak is not a nice word to use, but it's kind of a fun word, because actually he is brilliant at photographing the naked miners without them acknowledging that he's there. Now, the picture that's famous in the book is the one of the photographers all facing the wall. But amongst the negatives that were returned from Sweden includes a whole variation on this theme of lots of miners facing forwards, but also numerous different prints. And in one of them in particular, one of the miners is looking straight at the camera. So he can see what Cole is doing. Cole is sitting on the bench in front of him, photographing him, and he can see. And I'm fascinated by that because he obviously didn't.
Yeah. I'd love to talk about the influence of that photograph. Hank Willis Thomas was recently talking about the incredible power of that photograph and how, as a child, a bit like Hamish, he was looking at the book, I think, in his mother's bookshelf and was really impacted by that photograph that years later pushed him to make that sculpture that's now in the gardens of the National Memorial for Peace and Justice in Montgomery, Alabama. So this is, you know, we talk about legacy and influence in the younger generations in America. And so now let's talk about the archive and the discoveries that have been made. Here we have a few contact sheets, in fact, that you were referring to, James, on the South African work. And so there's plenty more, right? I mean, tell us maybe about what else was there in the archive. Is there being digitized at the moment in South Africa on the South African work beyond House of Bondage?
Okay, Mark, you've been looking at a lot of these recently, so you have a go at this one.
Well, I mean, just to go back a little bit, I mean, when I first came across Ernest Cole and House of Bondage, would have been around 2010 with James, because we were both building a collection of photography for a private client on South Africa, on the struggle against apartheid. And at that time, everything told us, all of our research indicated that Ernest's story, as James mentioned, just kind of closes down in the 1970s. And the myth was, or what we were told, was that all the negatives had been lost. That somewhere between the early 70s and at his death in 1990 or 91, I think. He had the negatives had just gone missing and the whole archive was lost. And so we proceeded on that basis. And, you know, the only thing that was in existence out there, which you could see, were vintage prints, occasionally held in various collections around the world. So with regards to the archive and the rediscovery of the archive, well, what a momentous event. But for sure, Leslie needs to spearhead that part of the conversation, because James and I came in as supporting actors on that process in Sweden, in Stockholm, which now maybe 5 years ago. And Leslie, the whole story of how this archive was rediscovered is, you know, beyond filmic, is it not?
Yes, it is, I must say. You know, I was just sitting and you know, around July 2016 when I received an email from Gunilla Knappe, you know, requesting an urgent meeting on the 29th of July 2016. And on top of that, she was requesting lots of, you know, information about the family. But I was like, you know, confused and at the same time thinking that the Hasselblad is seeking to prove ownership of Ernest Cole material. And in a preemptory fashion, they are demanding, you know, some information without, you know, attempting to, you know, clarify on what basis. So, and I, you know, the reason for the meeting to clarify the inheritors of Ernest Cole, you know, in that email was also well discussed and some of his material. But at the same time, I saw no reason why I should comply. But after several, you know, emails and discussions with the state-appointed lawyer, Ulf Bergquist, and then I decided to comply, and the meeting took place in South Africa, in Pretoria, at the law firm of firm that constructed the family trust. And it was a very interesting meeting in a sense that in that meeting, I also raised with the state-appointed lawyer the material held by the famous Hasselblad Foundation. And he, simply stated that he's not going to start any litigation at court.
But at this time, Leslie, you had no idea what it was you were even talking about, right?
No,
no one had told you.
Exactly. He tried to explain that it's lots of material found at a bank safe at the in a vault in a bank in Stockholm and so on.
But I remember you called James and I, and we had a conversation about it. You asked us if we would come and join you in Stockholm to, sort of act as, two sort of sidekicks with you, and all three of us, when we went in, because we should just separate it out, because there is the Hasselblad collection, of course, and then there is also at this moment this other thing that was brought to the table, which was these 2 safety deposit boxes that are being discovered at the SEB Bank in Stockholm, which there was no paperwork for it. No one understood what it was, and we didn't understand what it was until we actually arrived in Stockholm and were taken to the bank. And when we opened the safe deposit boxes, and I filmed you and your son, because your son came as well, and we filmed you both opening up the boxes, and lo and behold, inside there was the entire Ernest Cole lost archive. It was obvious within 10 minutes of looking through it that all the contact sheets were there. There was a couple of ring binders with all of the original contact sheets for House of Bondage with the negatives. But then it became more and more. We realized that there was the Ford Foundation material beyond anyone's expectations. We're talking, maybe 80,000 negatives in total, plus a whole load of ephemera and Ernest Cole's magazines and notes and notations. So how did that feel for you, Leslie, when you were, because for you, I know the first thing that you were concerned about was you were wondering whether or not you could find some pictures that Ernest took of you in South Africa when you were a small boy. You were obsessed by seeing if you could find those. Right?
Yes. I was excited that we've misplaced them, and I was excited that I could look at them, because we grew up spending our evenings looking at those beautiful images of ourselves as we were growing up, and we misplaced them, that's why I mentioned I hope I will find some of those images, but unfortunately, even after going through the archive, I couldn't find them.
But you still found the lost archive. So how did that feel?
Well, it was difficult to describe how I felt. Amazing stuff. It was so difficult. I can't even describe that even today. It was amazing to go through all those, what he actually did, during his time in exile.
And here, could we maybe, transition slowly to the never seen before American work, because that's going to be something that you found in the archive that is incredible and that nobody has seen before. So I'm going to go slowly, as you keep on talking about the archive, I'm going to slowly go through the American work, and maybe we can talk about that too.
Sure. Well, why don't I say that what happened at that stage, it was kind of a very strange trip to Stockholm. And I remember Leslie was flown in for 24 hours and had to go back to South Africa immediately. There were 2 extra seats on the plane for the archive to go with him back to South Africa. At the same time, it was bittersweet because there were other prints and other parts of the archive that we believed should also return, which were held by the Hasselblad Foundation, but we'll put that aside. But what then became very obvious is what do we do? How do we move forward with this amazing archive? And in the end, we split it. So the South African archive remained in South Africa and is being developed and digitalized by the Photography Legacy project over there. and it's at Wits University, and it's being slowly archived and digitalized. And the American USA archive stayed with Magnum in London, and we digitalized it there with Hamish, and the amazing job that Hamish did for that process. So before we get on to how it was digitalized and how we went through looking after the archive and the reasons for that, James obviously and Hamish worked very closely with going through the different images and understanding that archive. So Jimmy, maybe you'd like to talk a little bit about some of the photographs that Pauline's going to go through now. Okay, well, to be honest, I feel very much paired with Hamish on this. Well, both of because he brought a completely different set of eyes to it. I mean, I was looking at it almost totally in amazement because so many of the, first of all, the bulk of the pictures that we, the prints we discovered were, there was, I think, approximately 40,000 of them were American negatives. And since no material of Cole's had ever appeared, certainly nothing had ever been printed or sold as a print or appeared in magazines or anything else. Well, about three or four photographs which were held by the estate. Yeah, and that was it, right? That's all that was out there. But as far as we know, nothing beyond that. And so, you know, quite soon after we went to Stockholm, I rushed to South Africa, and I spent 2 weeks in a hotel room with a light box, going through these negatives, picking out 200 to make scans. And I had to do that very, very quickly and pacily, and it's quite difficult to find the right images at that sort of speed. But there were so many strange photographs gathered in Cole's work. I mean, the one we're looking at the moment, the one we were just looking at, Black Panther berets. There was one earlier of two gay people kissing by a subway station. And there's one with a police car crossing behind them. This one here is a very strong photograph, very interesting photograph. And slowly we began to understand that Cole was effectively in South Africa, in House of Bondage. He'd been photographing revolutionary photographs about campaigning struggle photographs towards change. In America, he's photographing a different revolution. He's photographing the revolution of Black power, of gender, of gay rights, of there's lesbian photographs. Lesbians for Nixon is one of his great photographs. He's photographing pop culture. He's photographing all the youth revolution that's happening in America at that time. And he seems incredibly drawn to this social transformation. And he's the difference between his American pictures, I'm going to hand it on to Hamish any second now, but the difference between his American pictures and his South African pictures for me is he's slightly withdrawn in the American pictures. So in a way, it's not as struggle orientated. He's almost out there as like a Candide figure, just recording everything around him and saying, you know, isn't it amazing? Look at this. And that's why he seems to be able to take something like the white-black images that he took in South Africa of the signs saying, you know, go this way if you're white, go that way if you're black. And in America, he photographs sex signs, sex cinemas. So, you know, great big billboards saying, you know, you won't be totally satisfied until you've seen this movie, and that sort of thing. And there's an amazing ability to transpose his South African experience over to the American experience, but without being clunky about it. I mean, there are beautiful photographs where he's, you know, this one's a very nice picture, the one we're looking at now, The Rise of Our People. Fantastic photograph. He's, you know, these are Black Power photographs. They're Black Pride photographs. Hamish, over to you. Is Hamish there? Yeah, you're on mute, Hamish.
I am, sorry, I was just taken off. Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I remember there was a process. Obviously, the negatives came. Leslie brought the negatives to London. We had to digitized all the contact sheets, and then, you know, and contact sheets. Anyone that worked in the analog era, contact sheets is really where you see the photographers. You know, you're almost walking with the photographer as they're going through the set, and you really pick up the style. I mean, what was really one of the first things you do whenever you're doing the editing is you're trying to work out what did the photographer want to shoot. I mean, this is very important, especially at Magnum. You know, Magnum, the only real definition of Magnum is it's the photographer's point of view, and sometimes that, you know, that's what you're there to promote. And so the first thing you do is you want to see what is his edit, what is his story, and what on those contact sheets, on the negatives, there's just no marks. I mean, normally photographers make marks on contact sheets. This is my edit. You'll see certain situations for people that haven't looked at contact sheets. You'll go through a certain situation and they'll put a little Chinograph mark around the picture, and there's different grades of Chinograph marks. I had different, but most photographers work in a very similar way in the analog era. There's nothing. There was absolutely no markings, nothing. We you know, the only markings that were there, I can't even, there was a couple of markings on about, from the 40,000 pictures, about 100 markings on little notes. I can't even be sure those are Ernest's. They may have been someone who was developing them at Magnum because he was working through the Ford Foundation. It may have been someone there because,
or in Sweden.
Or in Sweden, it may have been an editor. So it's really difficult. So the starting point was it's really difficult to know what is Ernest's edit, because that's the first thing. That Magnum, that's the most important thing. What is the photographer's edit? And then the editor comes second. And so you're almost editing blind. But to be honest, when you started to go through the contact sheets, and I'm probably like Ernest, I'm looking at it. I'm not a New Yorker at the time. It's not the same struggle that he had in America. I'm looking from the outside as well, and you feel you're walking with him through these situations. And there's a very big difference in the shooting that he did in New York to the shooting he did in the South, which comes later on. Because in the New York, all I can feel is when you look at the South Africa contact sheets, you feel the oppression almost as you walk through the contact sheet. You can feel it. And when he's in New York, it's a lot of it is joy. It's you know, there's a revolution going on, but there's an amount of joy. He's almost looking for the reactions differently to when you're in South Africa and he's shooting, where you're often doing things surreptitiously. A lot of the America pictures, what I notice is he's almost looking for a reaction from the people he's shooting, which is probably very different to when he's trying to shoot things around the apartheid struggle. And that really, you know, I really wanted to get that over in the pictures, because sometimes you often see pictures, he would wait for the picture till the person, you could see it in the contact sheet, he'd wait till the person almost acknowledges his existence when he's shooting. And then he'd take, and that's the shot maybe that he was looking for, because it was often the end shot. Sometimes that's the first shot in a sequence by a photographer, because the person's noticed, and then you're waiting for them to blend back into the background. But often it's the shot that he seemed to want. And it was, you know, sometimes it was a bit like there was 40,000 negatives, and like a lot of things when you're editing, I mean, the thing to get over is you're trying, when you're editing at Magnum, it's not like, Magnum isn't sort of like a traditional, what you might say, like a Hasselblad photo archive, where you're recording all the work, all the bodies of work, all the notes, or everything. You know, at Magnum, you've got to balance things out. It's a commercial organization. You have to also think is what is actually marketable for the era. You know, I'd really hope that one day with the South African Legacy Collection, what I hope is that there where you really get to see the archive, you get to see all the contact sheets, you get to see how he walked through those situations. Well, what we edited in New York, and a lot of this is to do with constraints of investment, is you're often looking for what is saleable. When in a lot of the work, I mean, he was shooting, it looks like, for the Ford Foundation, but I'm not sure even what the assignment was. It really wasn't very clear. But really when you look at when he goes into the Deep South pictures, particularly, what I really started to find was it didn't look like his story at all. You know, there's a lot of things in the civil rights in the Jim Crow South. We've seen other photographers document that quite extensively. There's a lot of civil rights photographers within Magnum as well.
Hamish, can I interrupt? Do you think that those Deep South photographs were done as a kind of a journalist story, or an assignment that was outside of, and then New York
is his story?
Is his story a Ford Foundation project?
Yeah. I mean, Yeah, there was there was supposed to be a story on the, you know, black people in urban environments. That's what we sort of knew about and I'm not sure, but so much of the New York work is really personal work. He's just jumping on the tube. A lot of it's in Harlem and the Greenwich Village. He's going to those places where there's activism very often. When you go to the South, it starts to become a very straight journalistic work, and and the other thing is, I'm not sure that archive is complete. I just, it's hard for me to think that he went down there and shot
Hamish,
so little.
can I cut in there, because I really wanted to ask that question. I don't think the Deep South archive is complete. Okay, like we know that the Swedish stuff disappeared somehow, okay, because we found so little of it. I've just got a feeling that there was a lot more Deep South stuff. And for some reason, that's why it doesn't make sense. Because what you don't have is his fantastically smooth, almost laid back street life stuff, you know, go out on the streets of Memphis and photograph the South. Yeah. And that would have been really interesting, but there's none of that at all, is there?
Yeah, no, it really, and even when if we follow the numbering on, I'm not sure if he did the numbering on the pictures. Like we have numbering systems, obviously. It doesn't track, and the way that negatives are often taken out of sheets, it almost looks like a non-photographic person has gone in there somewhere, because there was photographic strips, which really you don't find many photographers take a strip out of the negative and put it into another strip somewhere else irrelevant. It looks almost like people were trying to match things up somewhere in the history of it all. I'm not sure how. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe that is all there is, but it just seemed like when you have an opportunity like that to go to the South, I mean, there was partly, you know, we know from his comments that, you know, he'd said when he was in South Africa photographing apartheid, he was never scared for his life. Going to the Jim Crow South, you know, we've seen these notes where he said, I was actually scared that they will, you know, he never thought in South Africa any apartheid government or any of their security apparatus would kill him. But he said in the Jim Crow South, I wasn't sure of that. And that does come out in the pictures a bit. And even subsequent conversations that we've had with people around the time that, yeah, it was quite scary. A black photojournalist going into that area is a dangerous situation. You know, and maybe that comes out in the pictures, but you sort of get the feeling that this is not the same struggle necessarily that he photographed in South Africa. In South Africa, he was very much part of that struggle. He was photographing his own life. And in South Africa, yes, there's similarities. In America, I mean, in the Deep South, there's similarities. But we even saw in some of his written notes on magazines that he'd write comments about what he thought about the civil rights movement and not necessarily agreeing with all the mainstream opinions on it from the civil rights movement. You know, he had different opinions, and you know, it wouldn't have been the same. You know, for photojournalists going in, I mean, one of the things about most photojournalists is when you become very professional, is you'll find many photojournalists learn their craft by doing something they're the most passionate about. So you find that often with photojournalists, their big body of work is something that they're supremely passionate about, but that informs a professionalism that they carry on into their other work later on in life. Like every story they can go to, they can apply that professionalism to it. The Deep South is probably one of his first stories like that. Let's be honest. It's like he's outside of South Africa. He's going to do a story that's a very complex story. And he's been in America, where you've got photojournalists, who's probably the most hard-nosed photojournalist, you know, place to work in the world. And he's a 23-year-old shy. You know, everywhere you read about him, he's very shy, and he was very driven. That, you know, he's not a great salesperson for himself. One of the things about photographers is you have to be a brilliant salesperson for yourself. As a freelance person, you're always he wasn't that person, you can see. And I think he definitely would struggle in an environment. And when you're being sent to do a story like the Deep South, which is very nuanced and not as, you know, people might think of it simply, oh, it's, you know, it's another black liberation struggle, but it's totally different to the majority rule struggle of South Africa. And you'll struggle with those nuances, and photography is about, especially the photographic essay, it's about bringing out those nuances, you know, in those to how do you form that opinion. And that's why it was important for me to try and work out what is his story, what was the one that he's doing. And you know, there are 100 pictures in there which at some point will frame this. These are the ones that could have been his choice. They're not always what I would say would be my choice. Of course not. Everyone has a different opinion, but it's quite interesting what he saw as his choice. There wasn't much from the Deep South that he'd chosen as well. It was a lot of it was New York.
Thank you, Hamish. We have to wrap up soon, and so I'd like to ask one more question before, if we get any questions from the audience. But for you all, what's your hope for the archive going forward? I mean, working with you all, I know as the cultural director here, we've been talking about hopefully publications and exhibitions and but how would you describe, your hopes and your work with the estate? What's to come?
I think Leslie should kick that one off.
Well, our hope obviously is to see another book coming on his photos, as he mentioned in some of the articles that we found, that he was hoping that his photographs will end up in another House of Bondage similar book, a photo book, and we are hoping that we will be able to do another publication on the South African material, on the US material. We are hoping that we'll be able to do exhibitions, especially in South Africa, where he is not so well known. We think we should bring him back home and then showcase, the South African public, his talent. That's really, our dream.
Thank you.
I just want to throw in as well that I would dream, and this really is a dream, that the American material that was lost from that hotel, the story that Joe Ledeville tells of the Cole's US archive, in inverted commas, whatever it was, the stuff that he left in a hotel and that got dumped, sold, burned,
which we thought was this,
whatever. If that ever surfaced, that would be just the ultimate dream, because it would be, in a dream world, it would be the missing parts of this. It would be like a jigsaw that slotted together. One had a total understanding of what he'd been doing up until he stopped doing photographs. He is an amazingly rewarding artist to write about, because the thing about Cole is that just when you think you finally understand him, something else surfaces which shows you that it's still more complicated than you thought. Don't you agree, Hamish?
Yes, definitely. Yeah. I mean,
really has that.
Yeah. I mean, really, if you can get one day, the whole contact sheets go into that South African archive, you really get to discover that, because, as I said, when you edit, you edit with certain principles and with constraints, obviously, on how much you can edit at the time. But I think by viewing those whole contact sheets, those other stories will start to come out of his life.
We have a question here from the audience. Are Ernest Cole's photos in the collection of any US museums?
Yes, is the answer. In the last 3 or 4 years, I was just about to say, it's been amazing placing photographs and vintage photographs in some really, really important collections. They're in the Museum of Modern Art's collection, also the Art Institute of Chicago, Smithsonian, Philadelphia Museum of Art. So some major institutions in the US. And what's super exciting is that it's only like 3 or 4 weeks ago that the Tate opened with a part of their permanent display with a room to Ernest Cole for some of the prints that they have in their collection. So in the last, working with Magnum for the estate and Magnum working together, and also a little bit with some independent galleries, we've managed to place some of the vintage photographs in some of the most important collections in the world. Pompidou Center in Paris is another one. So, and the Metropolitan, of course. So yeah, plenty in the US.
Thank you.
Okay.
Shannon, where are we with time?
Yes, we're perfectly on time. Thank you so much. And I'm afraid, I think we could continue the conversation clearly, but we will have to wrap it up and have a quick 10-minute break before we come back and meet Sana Mansour and Olivia Arthur to talk about the Inga Marath, the legacy of Inga Marath. So with that, thank you so much, Hamish, Mark, James, and Leslie. Thank you for your time. That was really fascinating. And thank you to everyone for joining, and quick break, and hopefully please join us back in 10 minutes.
Yeah, thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.